Race relations. It's one of the great challenges of American history, maybe the great challenge of American history. A number of years ago, I was a nominee for Congress in Los Angeles. I was 26 years old at the time, and people would ask me, they would say, what qualifies you, at the age of 26, to run to represent a district as complex and diverse as the California 43rd in Los Angeles? I would tell people, because it was a mixed district, multicultural, predominantly inner city, predominantly African-American and Latino, but with a contingency of Republicans and suburban middle-class white people in it as well. And I would tell people, I would say, well, I come from a unique sort of background. My mother happens to be a liberal black Democrat from inner city Los Angeles. My father happens to be a conservative white Republican from Tennessee. I grew up explaining my father to my mother and my mother to my father, and that's why I think I can represent a lot of you. So, my father, he is a conservative. He raised me in a very traditionalist sort of way in many respects, raised me to believe that the United States of America was the greatest country on earth, that there was something unique and exceptional about our culture and so forth. But my father was a person whose heroes in life growing up were Willie Mays and Muhammad Ali and Bill Evans, white jazz pianists who came to fame playing with John Coltrane and Miles Davis. My dad was a person who loved black culture from the very beginning, a person who had spent his career, he's a jazz musician himself, playing with black musicians, working with black artists, and he raised two black sons who he loved more than anyone else in this world. So I was able to talk to people in the inner city community and say, I know we've got feelings about Tea Party supporters and conservatives and so forth, but the stereotypical image that we have in our mind is not always the image that reflects the individual in reality, and so we have to recall the common humanity that exists between us because these stories are real. And one of the things I was able to do in campaigning in front of conservatives in the community, talking to Republicans in Los Angeles and elsewhere, was to talk about the inner city stories that they don't know and the reasons why people of color feel a certain way oftentimes, feel a certain sense of inward conflict about our love for this country, the United States of America. Because on the one hand, there is no limit to the inspiring stories that the black community has to tell, and I speak to that because I have a particular connection to that. But on the other hand, there is a history of difficulty that a lot of people have a difficult time having a window into. So sometimes people will ask the question, they'll say, well, why is it that folks maybe on the left and folks of color have a difficult time sort of embracing the greatness of America? And America is a great country. It's a beautiful country. But if we talk about the history of this particular group of people, we all know about slavery. We can go back 200 years to a time when people were in bondage. And we can recall that coming out of slavery, there was 100 years of Jim Crow oppression. If we talk about people who live in the Jordan Downs projects today, and this thread will connect itself in a moment, just to let you know, I lived for a year in the Jordan Downs projects. I married a woman from the Jordan Downs. I, on one side of my family, have white millionaires, and on the other side of my family have black people from the inner city. I grew up in 3 different areas, multicultural, middle-class Culver City, day-to-day, spent the weekends with my inner city relatives on the black side of my family. On Saturdays and Sundays and on holidays, I went to visit my wealthy white relatives in La Jolla County and city in San Diego. They had a house right down the street from Mitt Romney's, the one with the car elevator, if you guys can recall that. I knew, and after marrying my wife and living in the Jordan Downs projects for a year, I met black people in the Jordan Downs who had never been to the beach in Santa Monica. And that seems like an impossible thing. So you go to slavery, you think 200 years in bondage, you come out of that, the difficulty of Reconstruction, segregation, terrorist oppression at the hands of the Ku Klux Klan. Many black people living in the South, when you got into the middle part of the 20th century, moved out to the West Coast for the opportunities to work in the munitions factories during World War II. That's how people wound up in the Jordan Downs projects and the Imperial Courts, the major housing projects in the West Coast. But manufacturing opportunities ultimately went to China. Economies changed domestically. And during the 1960s, a time when we think of as representing great social progress in the United States, you also had the decapitation of black leadership. You had changes in policies that, through the Great Society programs, gave us a way to subsist. But with the erosion of economic opportunities, subsistence didn't provide a sense of community, and so social ambition wound up going in the direction of joining gangs that were flushed with drugs coming in from outside of the country The domestic economy, the way to find ourselves in a situation to where we had a sense of community around us, was tied to a life of crime and violence, and then mass incarceration comes on top of that. And it leads us to a situation to where, to this very day, in 2019, we have young black men living in inner-city housing developments and projects whose only experience with white people has been experienced with aggressive police officers, overworked social workers, and public school teachers who very oftentimes mean well but can't keep up with the demands of the job. Tell me, at what point in this story has a young person in the Jordan Downs projects who comes from this history ever truly been free? And so it's nobody's fault alive today that this history was set in motion the way it has been. But it does leave us to a situation to where this young man's experience in America has been circumscribed in a vicious sort of way, and yet we wonder, why can't this young man love America the way we do? You know? But the thing that I come back to in my own thoughts about this is the fact that if we predicate our goal of creating a common American community, in some sense of a shared American identity, upon somebody's ability to win a polemical argument, then it's never going to happen. There is truth, and we should all be striving for the objective truth. But we are all destined to strive for the objective truth from the vantage point of our subjective personal experiences. We've all lived different lives. So is there anything that can transcend our differences in the project of trying to create community? And my answer to you is that yes, there is. It is the power of love. Through nonviolence, love as a social value. Somebody asked me, what does love like that mean? Martin Luther King Jr. described love, agape love, as not affection or romantic interest, but rather as an overriding sense of goodwill towards the other person, even and perhaps especially towards your opponent. It's the type of love that Arthur Brooks writes about in his recent piece, Love Thine Enemies. Love Your Enemies. And Martin Luther King Jr., in talking about integration and the need for us to transcend racism, he didn't talk about it in merely structural terms. Of course, Dr. King was very committed to remedying the mechanisms of structural oppression, but that was the beginning. It was a subcomponent of a larger moral mission. Dr. King made an active distinction between desegregation, which was removing the barriers that stand between us and being able to occupy the same lunch counter, go to the same schools. He made a distinction between desegregation, which was necessary, but technical, and integration, which is an affirmative matter of the heart. Dr. King described integration as representing the positive, quote, the positive acceptance of the full range of human activity, that it is, quote, an affirmative intergroup and interperson activity. Dr. King sought integration. He didn't seek desegregation. And integration comes when we find ourselves able to recognize the thou-ness in the other person, the fundamental human dignity, meaning that in every word we speak to another person, even and including our oppressors, if we see someone else as oppressing us, we speak that word to him or her with that person's benefit in our minds and in our hearts. So Martin Luther King Jr. is not here today, but his example remains with us. If you're speaking to a Trump supporter whose policies you feel are an active threat to your community or to yourself, Dr. King would advise you to speak to that person in love. Speak to that person with truth, but speak to that person with that person's own well-being in your heart and in your mind, and not just your own community. And if you're a Trump supporter or conservative and you feel that the policies of the progressive or the liberal left are ones that are uprooting us from these countries' historic values, from our histories, and you're concerned about the consequences of big government, so on and so forth, have that conversation. But have it with a heart towards lifting up the well-being and the goodness of the person with whom you are debating in mind. And see, there's an innate humility that comes in this way of communicating. Dr. King spoke a language that appealed to everybody's emotional and moral foundations because love allows you to do just that. When people are coming from a human place, that means they have something in common with you. And so I ask you all to remember that, to adopt this ethos of love and nonviolence in your heart. There's also a spirit to our work here, which will allow us to articulate a message of love that is more powerful than the tones of division coming from the right or the left. Because it's not about right or left.
I really believe in civility. I really believe in the power of love. But I have never seen I am almost 62 years old, and I have never seen this before. And so I just want to also put that out there that it goes so far sometimes. And sometimes we really have to draw a line on what we'll tolerate.
I understand. And if I could say something to that, because I think that the point is well, it's certainly one that's easy to sympathize with. It was one that Dr. King dealt with in his time, too. Dr. King wrote and spoke about the ethical demands of integration. And I mentioned the term thou-ness. Part of what he talked about with respect to thou-ness was intending the good for your opponent. But he was very clear to say that that rule applies even when you're dealing with somebody who is oppressing you, ultimately. And King was also quick to say that that is not something that feels fair to people who are being oppressed, but that it was nevertheless something that was empowering. Because when we carry, and I'm not saying this to suggest that anybody with this concern is necessarily carrying around bitterness, but it's a broader statement. When we carry around bitterness towards people who we feel have wronged us, we punish ourselves with that, ultimately. And we also lessen our ability to reach the hearts of people whose hearts and minds could be changed if we were able to summon from ourselves the moral power to reach out to their humanity. So as a practical matter, both on the level of reaching out to others who may be doing us injury, as well as alleviating from ourselves the burden of hatred or bitterness, it is imperative for us to find a way to love our enemies, because ultimately that accrues to our own power at the end of the day. It doesn't take away from our ability to stand up for truth.